Welcome to part 2 of our Patrick Hemmerlé presentation. The Zoom meeting has begun, and the viewers are being invited to ask their questions.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Zoom meeting of questions for Patrick relating to his talk. Brian Call, could you unmute and ask your question, please?
Evening, everyone. Evening, Patrick.
Good evening,
Good to
Brian.
see you. I was very interested in your commentary about enslavement and Ravel, the composer.
Oh, I do remember. Yes, yeah.
He was quoted as saying, it was sort of a rhetorical question, an open-ended question, and he actually said, anybody who plays my music is my slave. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, because you went on to say, when do artists sometimes play with such a spirit or esprit that the artist actually enslaves the composer? An example that sprung to mind when I asked you the question was, I've listened many times to Marta Argerich, the great Argentinian pianist, and particularly when she plays the Ravel Piano Concerto in G. She plays it, in my view, to my taste, more engaging than anybody I've ever heard. And it struck me she might be an example of a pianist who enslaved Ravel instead of the other way around. Just be interested in your comments on that.
That's interesting because I haven't ambivalence with Marta Argerich because she's undoubtedly one of the greatest pianists of the 20th century. And yet, there are very few things that she has done that I like without qualifications. And certainly her Ravel Concerto is something that I do have some problem with. And you are right. I mean, she's played that piece hundreds of times in concerts. Even on YouTube, you have, I don't know how many different videos of her playing the piece at different decades of her life. She has come to be associated with that piece in a way that, yes, have marked any musician. And yet I do think that in some ways she's quite far off, actually, stylistically. For one thing, because quite simply, we know the sort of speed Ravel expected for the piece, because Ravel actually worked at all his music with some interpreters of his time, people like Perlemuter or Casatsu, and they have notated, and so we know roughly what he expected. And in the finale, for example, which she takes exactly as fast as is humanly possible, it's like 1.5 as fast as Ravel ever wanted it to be. And it sort of destroys the neoclassical feel of the music and even the jazz feel. It becomes a sort of a race, and it's exciting and it's everything you want it to be. But I do think an aspect of the music is completely lost in that sort of interpretation. And unfortunately, it has really tainted our appreciation of the work because everybody is doing the same. And I know because I played the work last year and I had a really, really hard time trying to get that picture out of my memory because I felt if I didn't play at this kind of speed, something would be wrong. And I knew that it was silly, but I heard it so many times at that speed that I couldn't really get it out of my head, if you want. So that is certainly one way in which I think she has done a little bit of damage to the piece, if you want.
It's interesting, Patrick. Certainly with the final movement, it's very, very fast, over a couple of breaths. But would you say the same thing about the the second slower movement. The difference I find is it's the continuum between being very clinical and accurate and being expressive. And in the second movement, not just her playing, but her body language, her facial expression, in my view, really get into that second movement very well. The one that I like, by the way, she plays it with the National Orchestra of France.
Right. Well, I can't remember that specific one, but I mean, I've seen quite a few, and her interpretation, if you want, essentially has not changed drastically. So we know what we are talking about. I mean, I do like it for what it is. The problems I see is that in Ravel, you are always on a really tight line about. I mean, Saint-François used to say he's like a vampire. There is something dead in his music, and it's difficult to understand what he means. But you know, he was fascinated by mechanical toys. Ravel, he had a passion for that. And it really comes out in his music in the way that although it's passionately, burningly expressive, it is always done with a certain detachment. So the appearance should remain cool, and you should be sort of guessing the heart underneath. And with Martha Argerich, the appearance is not cool because she is herself. So, do you see? So she doesn't have this sort of coolness and distance that in my ideal of the music would possess. What
so
she does
in your typology, she'd be too romantic.
Yeah, that's how I would say it, yes. It's too first degree sort of reading, if you want. There should be a sort of distanciation with Ravel. And that is a quality that she simply do not have, if you want. However, many other qualities she has, and she certainly does, because she's a great pianist and she's a great musician. And in fact, I think she got better as the year went. And I think that more recently, tend to be better. She was a bit of a wild horse in her youth, and it tempered a little bit. Yeah. But yes, I don't know. I heard, when I was preparing the work, I heard a recording, which is not at all well known, by Charles Munch, the great French conductor, with a pianist called Nicole Henriot-Schweitzer, not nearly as well known. But I think they captured something of the piece that Argerich fails to capture. Anyway, that's all my...
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Well, thank you for your question, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. Toril Orsk,
yes.
If you could ask your question, please.
Okay. I found your talk actually very interesting. I have to say that first.
Thank you very much.
But you taught us, of course, it is about interpretation. So, and you also stated that no two performances are the same, naturally, as people are different in the way they play. So we can, even though then, recognize the piece. But you also mentioned that we should go with the good interpretation. So my first question then is, how do we know what is the good interpretation, or which one is the better one? Right. And secondly, maybe, who decides which interpretation is the better one?
Okay. Well, as far as I remember my talk, and I think I do because I had to record it so many times before I got something decent, I didn't say we should go with a good interpretation. I said that a good interpreter is someone who is going to materialize one of the better possibilities.
Okay, yeah, it's just different wording.
Because, I mean, that we should go with a good interpretation is kind of self-evident, really. I mean, no one would willingly wants to hear a bad interpretation, would they? Unless it is to actually to understand. I mean, if you do a course on interpretation and you want people to understand the difference, you might show them a bad interpretation or something you consider bad, and then a good one, so that, you know, by contrast, they would see the difference. Because it's not easy for people who are well, have an interest in music but do not play anything, it's not easy at first to distinguish different interpretation of the same piece, because it can be very subtle. I mean, it can be very obvious, but sometimes the differences are incredibly tiny things, which to us musicians makes a world of difference, but realistically, for somebody who is not trained, it's very small. I think, okay, it's, I don't know to what extent it is entirely subjective, what is good and what is not, and to what extent there are some criterions which you could describe as being objective. What it seems to me that anything, any adjective you might attach to an interpretation can be taken both ways if you want. So, for example, we were talking about Argerich, and most people would say, well, she's wild and she's incredibly virtuosistic and she's passionate and all those things, and she's all that. Then it really depends whether those are positive qualities as far as you are concerned or not. For some people, this sort of wild horse quality of Argerich is a wonderful thing. For me personally, I find that sometimes she lacks a policeman to rein her temper, if you want, temperament. Somebody might have the ability to do incredibly beautiful things, but for some people that might mean that they really lack a sense of passion and a lack of... So it really, I don't think there is any fix. I mean, a good interpretation is for you what resonates with you at a given time in your life. I mean, there are things that I found wonderful 10 years ago, which really, to me these days, have completely lost their appeal. And the opposite is completely true. I now genuinely like a lot of things that I really didn't like only a few years ago. And when you always feel that, yes, now you are justified and you are right, and this is, in the end, it's, you can never say, I mean, unless you are talking of something grossly inferior, somebody who doesn't have the technique to express what you want to say, for example, well, okay, but that's an amateur. If you are talking about a professional, someone who can do what he wants, or at least can convey enough of what he wants, then you enter a highly subjective realm. And it's always going to be dodgy to say, well, this is not good. The best you can say is, I don't like it because, or I like it, because this sort of quality appeals to me. But there is not one interpretation which is universal, that covers every aspect of a work. So, yeah, everyone just highlights a tiny fraction of it, particularly if it's a really great work. So yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of it, really, actually. And if your tastes are broad, you might like many, many things. And some people are going to be narrow-minded and are going to specifically look after a certain quality, always the same, and therefore, like almost no one. But yeah, I don't think that you can say there is an objective truth and some people know what it is and some people don't. It's art. There is no morality attached to it. There is no, do you see? I mean,
Yes.
in moral, you can say, well, yes, if it does harm, well, then it's bad. In art, it's more difficult because actually the bad is accepted. I mean, you accept of a composer that he does something very ugly if it's meaningful. So you will accept the same thing of an interpreter, that he does something ugly and unsavory if it speaks to you. So yeah, I don't know. But if you have any view on this.
No, I understand what you're saying, and I totally agree with what you are saying, that it's fairly personal how you feel, even though, yeah, you need to try and be true to the composer, of course, but yeah.
Yeah, but even that, actually, sometimes you're not true to the composer, and it's wonderful.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, thank you very much.
all right, all right.
Thank you, Toril. We have 3 questions from Mary Taylor, which I will ask on her behalf. Patrick, could you say something about different editions and which are the best to use to get nearest to the composer's intentions? And do you think there is anything to be gained by studying the original manuscript?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because the attitude towards this has changed immensely in the 20th century. And it reflects something I talk about in this presentation, the gradual, how can I say that, our wish to be ever more faithful to the original intention of the composer. When you look at late 19th century edition or early 20th century, they were almost always edited by someone, a chap, who actually made sometimes very significant addition or subtractions to the music, which means that really people playing at that period had very little ways of knowing what a composer really wanted, because there was always somebody interfering, which is almost unthinkable for our mind. I mean, why would an inferior chap with no qualification we know of take Chopin etude and just take off the bit he didn't like or add dynamics when he wanted to? And yet that was completely common practice at the time. I have plenty of those editions, and it seems to be the norm. So the idea of what we call haut text absolutely didn't exist then. And I don't know how conscious the interpreters were and how much they cared, but realistically, that's a loss. And in fact, when we do hear some very early recordings, we can see that they were not playing, well, they didn't have access to the correct text. Now we have completely switched attitude, and we are in another extreme, is that our editions are more and more sort of getting back to the absolute core of whatever the composer had intended, to the minutest detail. And I personally think it's getting a bit nerdy. We are just trying to be more faithful than the faithful, you know. Every slight deviation is regarded as a sort of major heresy. And really, there is a point by which, I mean, I don't think composers were even expecting remotely that degree of adherence to their score. So we have gone from an extreme to another. And of course, it also depends on the composer. Sometimes it is actually useful to know what Beethoven really, really wanted, because his music requires a certain degree of precision. With Chopin, it's more difficult because he actually wrote sometimes many different versions of the same piece. So, well, actually, if he wrote 3 different versions of the same passage, he has thought them both. So he has thought them all, and it means that to a certain degree, they are all valid, and that there is not one definitive version of his music that he had favored over all of them. There usually was more freedom than we care to recognize today. And we think by that, by playing the absolute text to the minutest detail, we will be closer. But I think it's a completely wrong, we are on the wrong track, I think, when we get too much, into this. Anyway, so that's my take on this.
Question 2 from Mary. Is there any way of finding out how long a given work would have taken in Bach's time? For instance, the St. Matthew Passion.
Yeah, that's interesting because it has, obviously the metronome was a major invention and completely changed the game. In Bach's time, the most we could know really is at what time a piece started and at what time it finished when there was a representation. And we have some time duration. I'm not aware that we have any from Bach's music, but I'm pretty confident that we have some from Handel, for example, that it may have started at 8 o'clock and finished at 10:30. So we know that roughly it took 2 hours and a half in performance of an oratorio or something like that. But that whole aspect of tempo was a real issue, because once the tradition of performance is lost, and it's quickly lost because we went from Baroque to classical and classical to Romantic in a fairly short time, and those three aesthetics were very different. And really, it's apparent when we look at Czerny's edition of Bach Well-Tempered Clavier that he didn't have a clue about what sort of tempi were practiced at the time of Bach. He gives metronome number from the perspective of an early Romantic composer, and in many cases is probably twice as fast as Bach ever wanted his music to be played. And we know that today because we know a little more. Czerny knew nothing. He went purely by his gut instinct. And because he arrived 50 years or 70 years after, he was writing 70 years after, he was completely wrong. The only thing they had prior to the invention of the metronome was the pendulum. And they had a system to get to measure the speed, the tempo of a given piece, but it was not widely used. And really our information in that department is fairly sketchy. So that's why when you listen to recordings of Baroque pieces, even by HIP performances, you see that the tempo vary actually hugely from one performance to another, more than it would for works of the classical or Romantic period, because it's far from us, and a lot of the time we don't have a clue, and we can't trust just our instinct. We need knowledge. It's an interesting subject, actually, but it would be a whole talk just to itself. Question number 3, before I give you the talk.
The third and final question from Mary. You say that Bach wrote for specific occasions and probably didn't have in mind future generations. He himself must have studied earlier composers. Do you know who these might have been? And how long before Bach's time were they written?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. The key is in the word study. I'm sure he studied works of composers before his time, indeed. And in fact, we have evidence for this because he used to copy the music that he liked. And he copied a lot of music by Vivaldi, by Marcello, and everything that came under his hand that he liked, he would copy or transcribe. So he would take Vivaldi concerto for violin and transcribe them for the harpsichord, for example. And that was common practice for him. I tread on uncertain ground, but I'm not aware that he has very direct knowledge of a lot of music which is much earlier his time. By direct knowledge, I mean hearing in performance. Because I don't think there was a lot of performances of earlier music in his time. Because I think music was written for immediate consumption, completely unlike our time. He wrote a cantata every Sunday because he was commissioned to do so. All his music was commissioned. He never wrote a piece because just he felt like doing it. He was working for someone. So once it's done, it's done. I mean, music was it was disposable in some ways, which is why we lost some of his music, actually. he must have had some inkling that he was doing something valuable, because he took care to make fair copies good of some of his work, like the Matthew Passion. But a lot we've lost because it was not meant to stay, and I think the attitude was prevalent at the time. So he might have known a little bit of Heinrich Schütz, for example, who was a generation before him. How much he's known of the great polyphonists of the Renaissance, people like Orlando Lassus, or I'm not exactly sure. But I mean, he's not. Bach's music draws heavily on all kind of roots. He was actually a great absorber of anything he heard at all. And in fact, I've completed a recording of the Well-Tempered Clavier, where I also record a work by a certain Fischer, which is called the Ariadne Musica, and it was written shortly before it. And it's a collection of 20 Prelude fugues. And Bach makes very clear reference to this work. It's undisputable that he knew of it. So he was broadly, I mean, he knew as much as he could, if you want. But I don't know how far back in time this knowledge extended. My guess is not very, but you would need to talk to a Bach expert to have a more detailed answer.
Oh, thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Mary, for your questions. Did Stephen Goodwin join us?
I don't know. We have a Steve here who doesn't have a video or not sound.
Goodwin?
I have a very poor quality sound, if that's working.
Ah, right. But you are Stephen Goodwin.
I am lurking.
Right. Well, why don't we have your question then? And then we can finish.
Right. I can't remember exactly how I worded it, so I will stumble through and try and sound as eloquent as I try and sound when I write. But it was concerning interpretations that don't use anywhere near similar instruments. And that's not just, what I would term like, pianos and harpsichords that have got roughly the same number of notes. And, and
but you would agree, Stephen, that the sound of the tenor and the harpsichord, if you didn't know it was roughly played the same way, the instruments are miles apart.
Oh yes, from a timbre, but from a range point of view, they have more keys than anything else.
Yeah.
So, you can say, oh, the composer used this range of notes. Oh, that will fit on the piano, or that will fit on the harpsichord. It won't just naturally go and sit on an oboe.
But it's still a leap of faith as far as this type of sound is concerned, because, I mean, when you play for piano something which was written for the harpsichord, it really is very far apart. Anyway, it is a real transcription, I feel. But yes, I do remember your question, which was, do I have good examples of music which is transcribed from an instrument to another? Something along those lines. Am I correct?
Yeah, recommended listening, that sort of thing.
That sort of thing, yes.
That wasn't a comical.
No, okay.
Chopin played on toy buzzers and things like that.
No. I don't have an awful lot, but I'll tell you what I've... obviously the one who works really well, and I'm sure you know this, is Bach. He works extremely well on the xylophone. So, if you hear the Goldberg variation played by two xylophonists, for example, it's brilliant. The sonata and partita, for example, work really well on the guitar. He works well. He even works very well sometimes. If it's tastefully done, he can work brilliantly well on the synthesizer. So he really translates better than any other composer I can actually think of. Now, it happens, and that's by pure coincidence, that this morning I stumbled on something on the internet, which was two pieces by Chopin, an impromptu and a waltz, done by a soprano with obviously piano accompaniment. But it was very interesting. It's very far from the original, but it worked. It did bring something to the music that was valuable. And the other example I have, which is funny, but nonetheless very interesting, there is a YouTube channel which is entirely concerned with transcribing works, might it be Beethoven symphonies, or in the case I'm talking about the Rite of Spring, Stravinsky, and it transcribes for 8-bit digital sort of computer software. So essentially this type of sound you had when you played the Game Boy in the 90s. And it's fascinating because the Rite of Spring translates extremely well for that. You can actually listen to it and you will find it sort of compelling, although the type of sound is completely wacky. But I mean, it's a bit of an amusement, but it says something that the music can survive this, actually, this sort of transposition. But that's about it.
I'm Googling it as we speak. I've got one of the 8-bit Rite of Springs up.
Oh, you have it? Well,
yeah.
You won't waste 10 minutes having a go.
As someone that actually does this 8-bit sound, I'm surprised I haven't heard it before. But I think
you do that.
Yes, I'm curious about what you think about switched on Bach, because you mentioned if it's tastefully done, you can do it with synthesizers. Well, synthesizers are my main instrument.
Oh, I see. All right.
I'm curious about what proper composers and musicians like you think of people like me and our synthesized work.
Well, if you have a way to send me something by Peter or by John, please do.
I was thinking more of proper, like switched on Bach, for example, the Wendy Carlos stuff, and what you consider to be sensible synthesizers.
I mean, the only rule is it interesting and does it sound good? Does it say something, I'm not a purist at all. Well, I can enjoy the Rite of Spring on an 8-bit, if it sounds good, then it's worthwhile. But yeah, okay, do listen to it. You'll be fascinated. He's done it extremely well, actually.
Andrew Oars, please, if you
can
ask your questions.
Hello, yes. Your point on music markings for helping musicians interpret the composer's intentions was extremely interesting. You mentioned that the interpreter had much more freedom in the past, like with Bach.
Yeah.
And then that composers have become more strict over time through Chopin, and to Albeniz, who you say is taking it to the ridiculous.
Yep.
In your opinion, what is the right balance in markings and artistic freedom for the musician?
That's interesting. It kind of depends on the kind of music, if you want. Some composer will need to be more precise than others. It's a difficult balance, if you want. If you write too much, it's counterproductive. You smother the interpreter sort of. I'm playing a work by Godowski at the moment, who wrote pretty much at the same time as Albeniz. And he writes, every single note has a fingering, for example. All his pedals are marked. He has marked all his dynamics. I mean, the score is completely overcrowded. And he writes in the preface that he really insists that any people who is going to play the piece will really please adhere to all his markings scrupulously, even if they seem a bit much. And I'm saying, well, I'm sorry, but I will not, actually. Because those markings, for one thing, sometimes do not work, and they don't help. They really hinder. So that's another case of the too much. And on the other hand, there are so many times where I would have liked to be able to talk to Beethoven and say, well, what do you really mean? Could you tell us a little more? Because sometimes it seems a little bit cryptic, and we spend years agonizing on what he really meant by the writing, because it seems that... So the problem is, on the one hand, you have people who take too much for granted because they don't realize that future generation won't have the same natural sort of relationship to the style they are writing in. Then you have composers. So yeah, it really, I mean, people like Chopin, he strikes a fairly good balance, if you want. He really tells you what he wants, but the problem is there are a lot of things that he would have expected and that he didn't write still.
Oh, okay.
And again, if you do exactly what's written on the score, you are still fairly far. It's a really difficult question. I mean, musical notation is very difficult. On the one hand, it's very precise. On the other hand, because you are not expecting that everybody is going to do exactly the same thing, obviously you leave an area of freedom. Yep. How much freedom you give, how much do you actually want to say, how much you expect people to do out of what you do, those are questions that can't be answered easily. And it's interesting working with live composers because you can ask the question that you want to. Yes, Brian.
If I could just ask you, Patrick, for a quick comment on, it's really an anecdote, but related to what you were saying about Beethoven. I've been bearing in mind the 250th anniversary of his birth. I've been looking at a very, very interesting biographical piece written by Ferdinand Ries, one of his pupils.
Yes.
Ferdinand said that Beethoven had the habit of giving him his new manuscripts of his new works to look at. But one day, Beethoven noticed with a new work that Ferdinand was actually playing it without reference to the manuscript. He had memorized it. And Beethoven got very upset. And he said, "From now on, Ferdinand, I will never give you any of my new manuscripts." And he was true to his word. He didn't, although they remained good friends and a teacher-pupil relationship. Just interested in your comment on that. What was going on in Beethoven's mind?
Who knows what was going on in Beethoven's mind? But something you may not realize, or perhaps you know, but is that the idea of performing music by heart was completely alien to that period. When a student of Chopin arrived in a lesson without the music and said, "Well, I'm playing by heart and use the music," Chopin actually got really angry. That was completely, the attitude to performance was completely different. To a point that, I mean, we can't quite understand what it meant to them and what level of performance they were expecting. And I mean, quite realistically, the level of performance must have been quite poor, in fact. Orchestral pieces were barely rehearsed. People were not trained the way they are today. I mean, the super slick, absolutely not perfect performance that we deliver today and expect, that is almost 100% certain that it didn't exist. Most probably those people just conveyed an impression. So yes, I mean, the problem is prior to the invention of recording, we really can't know what was the attitude of people. So we are left with speculation, which, again, so if you ask me what Beethoven thought and what was in his mind, I can't know because it's too far already, although it's only 200 years ago.
Bearing out what you said, Patrick, I gather Beethoven did praise Ferdinand when he played properly rehearsed and practiced pieces in live concert later on in his life. So bearing out what you said, that it was not the thing of the era for people to memorize and play from memory. It must have been quite a shock to his system, in fact.
Yeah, and I don't really know why. I mean, to us, it feels very natural now to play from memory. There is actually a shame attached to not doing it. There is a huge peer pressure to play from memory. And when people don't do it, they have to justify, I don't do it because. And it creates a lot of anxiety for performers to have to do it.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
That's all right, Brian and Michael. Andrew, sorry. I'm getting confused with names.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Andrew.
I have more questions if you want to come back to me later after other people have had a chance to ask theirs. Since you've been playing Chopin since you were 13 years old, has your interpretation of his music changed over time as you mature musically?
Right. Yes, it changes all the time. And,
okay.
It's honestly, I would be very worried if it stopped doing so.
Right.
It's actually one of the thing I like most about being a performer is to see when you play a piece and you drop it and then you play it 2 years later that, oh, wow, okay, it's new. I didn't want to do that then and I hadn't seen that. And it is really wonderful. I mean, it tells you something about music, that it is so fluid that it will adapt to whoever you are all the time. Whatever person you are at any given moment in your life, you will find something new in it. And some people are more static than others, and those people I don't envy. I'm really not, if you want.
Sure.
And it depends on a whole host of things, of course. There is how much progress you've made. I mean, how much you've practiced and how much you've worked and how much you've listened, how much you've changed as a human being emotionally, how much you read about music and about the style. And I've changed my approach of Chopin also because I've looked more at historical texts describing, how his music was played at the time, and it opened new doors for me. So if you have this kind of curiosities, and that can also, yeah. But then also, since we have internet and we can listen to so many people, of course, it does inform your performance. Anything you like is something you might want to do in some ways.
Right.
That's what it is, being a performer.
That actually brings me on to my last question, which I think you've just answered. But I was going to ask how much of an influence other interpretations are on your work. When you borrow interpretation ideas from others, and so that this sets up a type of evolving ecosystem of interpretation.
I would think that's definitely true.
Yeah.
And you can see it even on a sheer technical level, that as soon as somebody achieves something, then you will find within a year 20 other pianists or musicians who can do the same thing. But you can see trends, if you want, evolving even stuff over relatively short periods, because everybody listens to everybody. I mean, and these days it's particularly true, of course. Yeah. Young pianists who are still doing competitions, they know perfectly well about each other, and so of course they influence each other. And I think it's a good thing in many ways. There is, of course, a downside. Like everything is, you might lose who you are in the spectrum because you have so many influences. So you might sort of normalize your interpretation so that you please everybody, or you try to please everybody. And that's a great danger of anybody between 20 and 30 at a time where they are not yet confirmed professional, but they are trying to make it. Uh-huh. So they have to try to please the maximum number of people. And by trying to normalize themselves so that they won't displease too many, they lose a part of their soul, really, which sometimes they regain later, sometimes never. But it's a great tragedy of our time, because we are so many and because it's so hard to make it if you want. Yeah. So unless you are a totally loose cannon, like somebody like Martha Argerich, who couldn't care less. But even her, I mean, she 60 years ago, she was trying to make it. It was much easier then. The people of my generation, or even the younger generation, the one who has grown with internet, they have it really hard because they know right from childhood how good people are around them. They can see all the child prodigies, you know, who put recording on YouTube when they are 6 and they already play extremely well. They have to survive that sort of level of competitiveness, which is, I mean, a lot of them must give up because, well, okay, what point? I'm 11 and somebody with 7 can do it much better than I do it. So yes, we are very well aware of each other, and for good and for bad is how I could answer your question.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Steve. There's one from me. You've spoken of objectivism, etc., in your talk. How would you describe your own approach to interpretation? And which school of interpreter would you place yourself in?
Right. I would probably say that I'm the least qualified person to make an evaluation about myself. Because as I said in my presentation, we all have a shadow. And I mean, I don't know who a part of me is, if you want. I may know what I would like to be. And I can tell you that. I'd like to have something of the people I described as the romantics. It does appeal to me, and a lot of the performers I tend to like most fall in that category. But I also would like to think that I have taken something of the HIP movement, historically informed practice. We have somebody in the chat, sorry. That's fine. So I would like to think that I am reasonably well informed about styles and the current practice. I certainly spend a lot of my time reading and trying to understand, and it has, I think, informed my interpretations. But it's a fine line. I mentioned I've done a recording of Bach Well-Tempered Clavier, which was a big project for me. And in it, it's very interesting because sometimes I play the music because, well, I like it that way, but I also think that it should be played that way. And sometimes I do some things that I'm pretty certain that Bach didn't have in mind, but it's what I want to do with it, if you want. So I feel that I'm taking the lessons knowingly, and that Bach might have wanted slower or faster or more something, but I'm just doing it differently because it's sort of my freedom as an interpreter to just take the text and do what I feel with it. And in that sense, I'm not an HIP, but I feel, well, I'd like to think that I can consciously navigate between currents and take what I like out of each of them, if you want. But maybe I'm deluded in thinking that. And that I cannot know myself.
Thank you, Patrick. Michael J. Lawlaw has joined us. Would you like to ask Patrick your questions, please?
I haven't actually made a note of what the questions were, so I've forgotten. I had a couple of quite diverse questions, one about period instruments and one about contemporary music and electronics.
I do have your questions, Michael, if you want written. Do you want me to read them, or?
That would be the best thing, yes.
I'll do that. I've switched you out for a moment, but I'll see. Right, and actually I was puzzled by your first question. So so you said most examples chosen were on pianoforte, but none on fortepiano, harpsichord. Even if chosen to perform on a modern Steinway, it is essential a performer understands how the original instrument may have sounded quite differently from the modern piano. The earlier the music, the more important this is, and it applies to all instruments. Choosing to ignore the evidence is not a good starting point. Understanding the evidence and choosing to disregard it because playing on a Steinway in a large concert hall is different from the original performance scenario is at least a better starting point. Some period instrument performers are not historically informed, and some modern players are. How do you reconcile the varied approaches to all music? Now, your question puzzled me in many aspects, and I actually wrote a little bit about it. I'll tell you what I've written, and then, yeah. So, for example, I talked quite specifically in that, well, I mean, I made a fairly artificial, if you want, division into three styles, if you want. One I described as objectivist, one I described as romantic, and one as historically informed. So obviously, out of those three styles, two have nothing to do with original instruments. And those styles were sort of current trend in the 20th and 21st century. And the people at this time either knew nothing about it or very little, or knew and didn't really care about it, because caring about this is something which came with the HIP. So what I want to ask is, sorry, I'm finding, why do you talk about choosing to ignore the evidence? What do you mean by evidence?
Some performers may just take the text, the written music, and just treat it like a blank sheet.
Yeah.
For them to just do what they like with the notes.
Yep.
And some will investigate how bowing might have been done, how the instrument might have been fingered, how the different tone or the lightness or heaviness and of a particular instrument and the balance between different instruments may have varied. And read up on instructions given in earlier times on how they expected their music to be played. So it's down to how much a player takes that into consideration and how much they don't, or if they do, but they're considering it translated into our time, that they can't do everything that would be ideal, but they'll do as much as they think they can.
Right, okay. I mean, you are really talking of the difference between what I would call the objectivists and the historically informed performers. And the objectivists were people who either didn't know much or were not terribly interested. And I'm talking of people like Pollini, Ashkenazi, Richter, Haskell, Solomon, Clifford Curzon. I mean, a vast array of performers who really play music through a 20th century perspective. They see the text in front of them. They read it through their 20th century mind and eyes, and they do what they think is true. But the attitude of really trying to recreate the style of a period, that is what characterized what you would call the HIP performance movement. And it's a totally different thing. You seem to imply that it is better, and maybe it is. On the other hand, there were great performers who didn't care a fig about all this. I mean, Furtwängler gave one of the finest Beethoven that we know of, and yet he knew really very little about the style that was practiced in Beethoven's time, and the kind of instruments which were, he knew nothing about it. He came too early. Whether he would have embraced it, we can't know, and it's speculation. But at the same time, now I understand what you mean by choosing to ignore the evidence is not a good starting point. People at this time didn't choose to ignore the evidence. They didn't have the evidence. They came too early. Today we do have the evidence, and it does create some cognitive dissonance for some musicians, because it does force you to go quite a long way out of your comfort zone sometimes if you want to understand what Beethoven really wanted to say, and how best to say it. And a lot of the time, if you want to be truly honest in this approach, you will have to switch instruments and play the instrument for which he was writing. Yesterday, I was listening to a performance of Beethoven Appassionata Sonata, and I was thinking, well, it's very good, but actually I do think that this sonata doesn't sound very well on a modern piano. I think if you really want to play this piece and and do it well, it would be better to play a forte piano from Beethoven's time. Does that in any way answer your question, or haven't I been clear?
Yes. A more modern example I can think of would be the left-hand piano concerto of Ravel.
Mm-hmm.
It was a complete eye-opener to me when I heard a performance with an Erard piano compared with the Steinway. The Steinway sounds like mud.
Yes.
But the Erard is so clear, even when you're down in the bottom of the range of the piano.
That's interesting. Yeah. Indeed. I mean, we gain as much as we lost with the modern Steinway. It has a lot of qualities, and it's an all-rounder. But because it is an all-rounder kind of instrument, it means that all the specificities are lost, indeed. And in any music that you are going to play from the 90th or early 20th century music, there are some aspects that are going to be lost. Because it can do, there was no piano in the 19th century that could do at the same time Brahms and Chopin and Schubert and Beethoven and a piano which would have been perfect for Beethoven would not have worked for Brahms. A piano that was perfect for Chopin, again, would not have worked for Beethoven. Now, of course, we play recital where we play anything from Bach to Stockhausen on the same instruments. It has to be normalized. And the modern Steinway does that beautifully, but there is a price to pay, of course. And I mean, I agree with that fully.
Yes, I've seen lots of let's say editions where the editor has tried to double up on the bass line, and you end up with a really heavy, ponderous accompaniment for an instrument, and it's just got to be redone, I think. With a modern piano, stop the octave doubling when you're doing trying to recreate the sound for the cellos and double basses. The double basses change the sound of the cellos. They don't add another octave below.
Yes, I see what you mean. But yeah, there are various ways in which you could do that. And of course, there was a taste at some point for rather mushy arrangements of works of Bach or things like that by people like Busoni, which today have largely gone out of fashion. And it is true that the style of both, well, actually Romantic, Classical and Baroque period was much leaner. Their speed are usually much faster than ours. And the type of sound they were looking for is much leaner than the great romantic sound that is really a 20th century creation. I mean, we have to even realized that vibrato was not current practice in orchestras before 1910, 1920. I mean, it came quite late. Brahms, Bruckner, they heard their music without vibrato, or at least without generalized vibrato. The type of sound was very different.
Yes, and sometimes the changes actually are far more recent than we think.
Yeah, well, certainly early 20th century. But we tend to instinctively associate a lush sound with romanticism, but actually it wasn't the case. I mean, the evidence is that it wasn't the case, that the sound was actually quite lean. And the instrument of the time reflect that. The tempi written by the composer reflect this. And everything we know about the style of performance reflects this. So, yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
I believe we have a question from David Drebin.
Yeah.
Are you there, David?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, right. Okay, you've written your question.
Yes. Well, I thought that I thought that we were all being put on mute and we couldn't come off mute. That's why. But I think what I found your talk very, very, very fascinating indeed. Your 52-minute video, and yes, I think that to some extent an interpretation should be, in some ways, a recreation of the score, but at the same time it should be faithful to the score as well. And you mentioned some pianists in the past, like the 60s and 70s, which may not have been the case. And I think Beethoven and maybe Brahms were very structural composers, whereas, for example, in the composer Chopin, not only were there very, very widely different interpretations, but it was said that Chopin himself would interpret the piece in a dozen different ways on a dozen different occasions.
That is true.
And I was just thinking whether I heard from somewhere about 10 or 20 years ago that with the interpretation of Beethoven, there isn't, as you said, there can be no interpretation which is a facsimile, if you were, as it were, of the music. And even though a person's personality may not impinge with the intention of that person, it would still impinge. What's the word? Unconsciously. So whether you like it or not. I think it was the great pianist Joseph Hoffman said that one should try and be as faithful to the score as one can before reaching out. So, and I think interpretation should just have an emotional content. But I was just wondering. My question is whether we're playing music of Beethoven, like a Beethoven sonata, whether there is nearer to an ideal interpretation than there is with some other composers, for example.
Okay. Well, I suppose the best way to answer your question is to say that what Romantic movement brought to the equation was really the idea of freedom to a large extent. And that also applied to performers, I suppose. It gave them a greater scope. I mean, at least that was the aim. So it wouldn't be foolish to think that indeed there is more freedom in playing Chopin, Schumann, or Liszt than there is in playing Beethoven or Mozart. People who belong to the classical style where the codes were in some ways more rigid. The problem is we really lack the evidence to see what people, how people played at that time. The earliest recording we have of at least a piece of classical music is by Reinecke, who was a Romantic composer, actually, born, I think, in 29, perhaps. Really early, 1829. And thankfully, he lived to a ripe old age, and he left us quite a few recordings, among which some extracts from Mozart. and it's completely, I mean, it really raises question when you listen to them, because he's on a different planet than everything else we know of. He really seems to play with a degree of freedom that we can't even begin to conceive as modern interpreters. And yet he was recognized at the time as a fairly dry, sort of to the letter kind of interpreter. So it really raised the question, well, who were the people who were recognized as romantic and free-spirited? And we can only speculate. And as fascinating as it is, we really will always lack the practical evidence, because really recording would have needed to be invented even 40 years earlier. And then we would have known a lot more. The problem is the first people we hear are people who were born within the Romantic generation. So we don't know whether their interpretation is in reaction to the rigidity that there was before, so that it kind of creates a sort of trend where it gets, you know, a bit rigid and then very free, and then more rigid again in the 20th century, and then maybe less rigid in the 21st century, or whether there is just a gradual narrowing down of our sense of freedom as interpreters throughout the centuries. We can't know that. The texts written by contemporaries take too much for granted for us to know very much about interpretation at that age. So Beethoven tells you a fair bit, and you might think that there is an ideal way to play his music, and maybe there is, but I'm not so sure, actually. I don't have any definite conviction regarding your question.
Yes, because even from some great pianists like Richard Good, Czeslaw Richter, Otto Schnabel, Wilhelm Kempf, even amongst the great pianists, you can have a myriad of different interpretations.
Oh yeah,
yes, yeah.
Myriad, yes, because they all come from different cultures. They had different sphere of influence. They had different ideals. And yet we sort of recognize them all as great Beethoven player. So it's possible that the work is bigger than what we can make of it. Really, I don't know.
Right. Was that all, David?
I've got one other. I've got one other
Okay.
brief question. Well, it may turn out, the answer may turn out not to be brief, of course, but it's about on the subject of performing Baroque period music on the piano.
Yeah.
And whether one should imagine it's a harpsichord or embrace whatever the piano can do. Like as well as J.S. Bach, I have a love of playing Domenico Scarlatti on the piano, and I must admit that I do make some dynamic contrasts, even though in almost all cases no dynamics were written in the score, and there's also the question of whether some very small judicious amount of pedal could be used rather than playing it entirely without pedal. I think tempo-wise, it should in general be at a constant tempo, but I think it shouldn't sound like a harpsichord. But I think something of the element of that should be when performing Scarlatti. I think with the great J.S. Bach, I think his music is more universal and can be played on different instruments, so it's less instrument specific. So so the question was how strictly to keep to the stylistic interpretation of what might have been in that time. We can never know for sure, as you've said, but what might have been for the for the Baroque period composers.
Right. Well, indeed. I mean, I could answer your question in half an hour, but I'll try to be quicker than that. The thing is, David, if you are playing this, well, if you think you should really be faithful to the style of the time and everything, then obviously you should put your piano away and take a harpsichord, because that's how you are going to arrive to a certain degree of authenticity. If you are playing on the piano, you are doing a transcription. Now, then it's up to you to decide whether there is anything wrong with that. But if you are doing a transcription, it's my view that you would be silly to do half a job and not to use the resources of your instrument, because you are sort of being, either you do it or you don't, but this sort of sitting on the fence is not a very interesting position. Because at the job of making the music sound good on a historical level, then the harpsichord is always going to be better than the piano. If you are doing a transcription, you are just putting the music in a different context, and you are seeing what qualities in this music can be brought forward by the use of a modern instrument. And indeed, experience has shown that in the case of Scarlatti and Bach, it could work extremely well. But the people who make it work extremely well are not the people who are shy and decide to put no pedal and do no dynamic, and because that's not interesting. Then you are less than a harpsichord and you are less than a piano at the same time. The sound of the piano without the pedal is only half of itself, really. The piano needs the pedal to function, to exist. The pedal is the color of the piano. The harpsichord cannot cope with the pedal. It's the wrong kind of sound. But the piano cannot cope very well with not having a pedal. And the piano cannot cope very well with not having dynamics as well. So I think when you are doing a transcription, which is what you are doing, you should go full way and accept
resources. Yes.
Well, accept that it's not a treason if you want. It's an experiment if you want. An experiment that Bach and Scarlatti might have regarded with amusement, curiosity, might have been extremely interested in it. You can never know, but you can go with your own test and say, yes, okay. I mean, I think out of all the prelude and fugues, a very large part of it worked extremely well on the piano. I think some work better on the piano than on the harpsichord. I think a few actually work better on the harpsichord. That's true. But I cannot think of one where I would think, well, okay, it doesn't work at all. No, maybe one or two, but it's marginal. But the act of transcription was current practice at the time. Bach transcribed all the time, and they all did it. Music was fluid. It was adaptable. So
there are of course ways in doing transcription, ways of employing the pedal. Like the pianist Vladimir Horowitz, of course, had some very striking, if you like, interpretations in all his interpretations. But an interpreter of Scarlatti I personally like is a pianist you've already mentioned in the talk, Clara Haskell. I think in my opinion she interpreted Scarlatti very well. It was very clear. She used some pedal and some of the resources of the piano, but in my opinion in a very tasteful way.
And Horowitz uses masses of pedal when he plays Scarlatti. And he comes out with spectacular Scarlattis. It works very well. A pianist like Andras Schiff, who played Bach for decades without using the pedal, I find a lot less interesting. Because I really feel, why doesn't he play the harpsichord then? What's the point? He's playing a very diminished piano.
Yes.
It doesn't stimulate me.
Yes, it needs some. Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. Peter?
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for answering the question. Yeah.
My pleasure, David.
Thank you, David. We will wind the meeting up here. Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for taking so much of an interest in my work.
Particularly thanks to Patrick, of course.
It was good to hear you all, to see you all.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. We hope you enjoy the finished video. Thank you. Bye-bye.